Good morning. Welcome to day 3 of the Psychological Health and Safety Learning Series. We've had a great couple of presentations already this week. On Monday, we learned about how to improve our emotional intelligence. And yesterday, we talked about supporting neurodiversity in the workplace. We are excited that you have joined us again today. I'd like to encourage you to follow our Facebook page this week as we post daily self-care tips, and they'll be quite helpful to you in the week to come. "988" was launched as a national suicide prevention line. If you or someone you know may be at risk for suicide, please call or text. It is a safe place to talk 24 hours a day, every day. Before we begin, let's just touch on a few little housekeeping items. In the handout section, you will find a PDF copy of the presentation for today that you can download during the webinar, and you can print off for your reference or keep for your reference. If you forget, you can certainly reach out to us after the fact and we can provide you with a copy of that. Asking questions, of course, is encouraged. We will have a brief question and answer period at the end, so please save your questions and have them ready for us. At the end of the webinar, you will receive an evaluation. I encourage you to complete the evaluation as it helps us continue to develop fantastic and meaningful webinars. You can also include any topics of interest that you would like us to see present. I encourage you to move around during the hour webinar, stretch, be comfortable, and make sure you stay in tune with your body and how you feel. So good mornings. My name is Kathy Bear-Brinson, and I'm here. I'm going to be joined today by Jordan Friesen, and I'll introduce him in just a second. So we're talking about psychological health and safety, evolving the blueprint in Canada and beyond. It's hard to believe that the CSA standard was released over a decade ago. Psychological health and safety has certainly been a big conversation in Newfoundland, across Canada, and in other countries and in other jurisdictions. The needle continues to move forward as we identify progressive actions, standards, and legislation and regulations, start to change and move toward supporting the psychological well-being of the workplace. So as I said, I am going to introduce Jordan Friesen this morning. He's joining us all the way from Winnipeg, and we just thank him so much for joining us. Jordan is the founder and principal consultant of Mindset Mental Health Strategy. And he's here today to talk a little bit about psychological health and safety and how it has evolved across Canada and in other jurisdictions as well. So Jordan is an experienced mental health leader who has developed and led national programs and initiatives focused on workplace mental health. He uses his knowledge of leading practices to assist organizations right across the country who want to take progressive steps forward when it comes to supporting the mental health of their workers. Grounded in his own lived experience of illness and recovery, he takes a person-centered approach on making workplaces healthier and ultimately more human again. So welcome, Jordan. I'll give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Thanks to everyone that's joined us today as well. I know we have likely a few hundred people here watching. Thanks for being here. Thanks for making time to learn about this topic. You've heard my bio. I'm not going to repeat it. My name is Jordan. My pronouns are he, him. I'm joining you from Winnipeg, Manitoba today, Treaty 1 territory, homeland of Canada's Métis Nation, land that I am very privileged to be able to work, live, and play on. As you see behind my name, I'm an occupational therapist by trade, so I'm a registered health professional here in the province of Manitoba, and really excited to talk about psychological health and safety with you today. In terms of our objectives for the next roughly 45 to 50 minutes, I want to make sure that we understand how psych health and safety has evolved in Canada as well as beyond. I'm also going to help us describe what I think are the core components of an effective psychological health and safety system or an effective approach to addressing psychological health and safety. There's a few best practices that I'm going to take a few minutes to spotlight as we go as well. And then we are going to build in some time for Q&A. So as I'm going, if you do have questions, go ahead and submit them in the Q&A box here on the GoToWebinar platform. We're going to make sure that we build in some time to answer them at the end, and Kathy will come back and help moderate that for us. So we're going to dive in, and the first thing we're going to talk about is really this evolving blueprint. As Kathy mentioned in her intro, psych health and safety, in particular Canada's national standard, has been a topic of conversation in workplaces now for over a decade, which is shocking. Time flies when you're having fun. But there have been a lot of other notable developments, certainly in Canada. We'll talk about what the global landscape looks like as well, just to give you a bit of context. And then from there, dive into exactly how you do it. Because I work with employers across Canada that are trying to figure this out, trying to take those progressive steps to improving the mental health and well-being of their people. And often the topic of psychological health and safety is one that gets complex or convoluted when I don't necessarily think it needs to be. So I'm going to share my framework with you to help you move forward in your workplace and to make a topic that can be a little bit complex and overwhelming, hopefully a little bit more manageable, understandable, and actionable at the end of the day. So what has the evolution of psych health and safety looked like? Certainly in Canada, and then we'll talk about abroad. And there's just a few notable developments, and many of these I'm sure you're quite aware of. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but it is interesting to think that it's been about a dozen years since that CSA standard was released. That was back in 2013, and at the time, it was certainly a huge step forward globally. This was the first of its kind, the first standard released anywhere in the world related to psych health and safety. And so Canada was certainly a pioneer, leading the pack and certainly leading the charge around this particular conversation in the workplace. But a few other notable developments, and what we've seen, generally speaking, is maybe not a full-fledged adoption of that standard in particular, but we have seen in Canada an increasing trend towards making workplaces that are more supportive of the psychological needs of their employees and certainly more considerate of how work may be doing harm to psychological health or well-being. So in particular, in 2018, in Ontario and now in most provinces and territories in Canada, some forms of psychological injury are now compensable. In Manitoba, this would be the Workers' Compensation Board. In Ontario, it was the WSIB. And so in most jurisdictions, there is now some form of compensable injury related to psychological health in the workplace. So again, that's a notable development, something that has shifted, maybe because of the standard, but also simply because I think of the evolution of work and new workers who are certainly asking for more from their employers and more to protect their mental health. Another interesting and notable development that certainly lines up with this trend is right to disconnect legislation. And this was something that came out in Ontario in 2021. So again, understanding that work can have a negative impact on mental health and well-being, and that it is actually good for workers, certainly in knowledge-based or corporate environments, to be able to disconnect and have that separation between work and other aspects of their life. Now, this legislation didn't start in Canada. Other countries in Europe adopted similar legislation well over a decade ago. But in Canada, we started to see this emerge around 2021 with mixed effects, I'll say. And then another really interesting and notable development that was built on our national standard was this global ISO guideline for psych health and safety. 45003 is the ISO guideline. And Canada led the development of this in many ways based on our work with the CSA standard. And so now that guideline has been published. You can find it online. And it's certainly informing countries around the world in terms of how they can protect the psychological health and well-being of their workers and use our CSA standard as a framework to help organizations worldwide figure out exactly how to do it, which I think is really, really cool and a feather in our cap for sure. But beyond Canada, what's been happening? A few other notable and maybe interesting developments that showcase that Canada maybe at one point was really ahead of the curve on this topic. But now there's many other countries that I would say are taking even more progressive action than Canada, and some that we can look to as exemplars and sort of take notes and best practices from as organizations here continue to develop their psych health and safety management systems. So the one I like to start talking about actually comes from France. And France was maybe one of the OGs, so to speak, one of the earliest adopters, largely because of the strong labor movement in France. But they have actually had equal protection for mental health and physical health in their labor code and built in since 2007 is when that amendment came to their labor code. So they actually started considering the impact of work on mental health even before Canada did, which I think is really interesting and something many of us don't necessarily know or maybe forget. The other country that I'd like to highlight here is Australia. Now, Australia over the last number of years has been making big moves around psychological health and safety. They actually began writing regulations and legislation for psych health and safety in 2021 in every province except one now. Virtually every employer actually has a legal obligation, a regulatory obligation to assess and mitigate psychosocial risks within their workplace. And so they have gone the step that certainly Canada hasn't quite gotten to, which is making the implementation of certain parts of a psychological health and safety management system mandatory. And so you can see stories and find stories of employers now that in Australia, if they fail to do this or they've failed to protect the psychological health of workers, that they're facing lawsuits or certainly even massive fines for not doing this. So they're leaning into that regulatory arm and really helping push employers forward in what I would say is a very positive way. But these aren't the only countries as well. Other countries that actually have distinct psych health and safety protection built into their laws or legal systems are highlighted on the screen here. We've got Chile, we've got Colombia, Brazil, Norway, we've got the UK, Spain, and I believe Sweden as well. So there's many other countries that are actually taking this issue very seriously. They're helping to move the needle, and some, again, that we can start to look to in Canada to share best practices with, which I think is really interesting. So at a very high level, I think what we know is that over the last number of years, worker health needs and risks have actually changed dramatically. I think about that COVID-19 pandemic that we all lived through and would rather not remember, 2 weeks to flatten the curve that turned into 2 years of our lives. And so we know that coming out of that pandemic, workers still remain at a higher risk for mental health issues or injuries, either work-related or outside of work. The risk for our workforce in Canada still remains quite high. The other interesting trend that I like to say, and this comes from some of my health and safety friends, and what they say very tongue-in-cheek is that every mandatory safety Canada that now exists, safety standard rather in Canada that now exists, was once voluntary. And so if we track that trend, we think about the CSA standard for psych health and safety, especially as we look to countries like Australia, not hard to imagine or suspect that we may see something similar emerge in Canada in the next 5 to 10 years, potentially. And then the last thing, and this is not so much a trend, but something that stayed pretty constant, is there continues to be a huge body of evidence coming out that supports the notion that creating a psychologically healthy and safe work environment is in fact still good for business. That hasn't changed. That was true in 2013. That is true in 2025, and perhaps even more true now than it was over a decade ago. And so it's still good for business and still something that from a very practical, pragmatic perspective, employers can and should be paying attention to. So what we see here across the world is that more and more organizations, countries are taking this seriously, some even moving towards regulation around this issue. And all of that, I think, paints the need for employers to continue moving the needle here in Canada. Now, I think part of the challenge, though, is that, again, if we think about a psych health and safety management system or thinking about how to create a psychologically healthy and safe workplace, it can feel complicated. It can feel a bit complex. And for those of you that have read our CSA standard, it's a very technical document. It's long, it's comprehensive, which is great, but it can be a bit overwhelming. It can be difficult for employers to truly understand how to get started and what are the key components that are required to create that psychologically healthy and safe work environment. And so I'm going to start breaking that down in a little more concrete detail for you. And my goal, my hope is to make it as simple and as accessible as possible so you can understand the framework that I typically use when I work with employers to help them understand what their role is and what they can start to do and prioritize first in their business. And so first, though, maybe a quick analogy. And this is, again, a story I use to help employers understand really what is the core of psychological health and safety in the work environment. Now, I've never worked in construction. Perhaps some of you on the line have worked in construction or you are currently working in construction. So this analogy might make some really good sense to you, but it certainly makes sense to me as well. If you think about any construction company or any work site, at a bare minimum, when somebody walks onto that site, an employer has an obligation, right, to ensure that they are physically protected, that at a bare minimum, that they are wearing, every worker is wearing their personal protective equipment, right? Their hard hat, steel toe boots, high vis vest, whatever it might be. I think we can all agree that an employer would be negligent if they allowed workers onto that site without the appropriate PPE, or if somebody showed up to site and didn't have their PPE, that they weren't supplied something at least temporarily to make sure that they're safe at work. We can all agree that that's a good thing to do. We got to wear our hard hats, wear our steel toe boots. But if you can imagine on a construction site that at random intervals throughout the day, the site foreman or a supervisor, maybe even the business owner, walked 4 stories up and started randomly dropping bricks on the ground below. It's not hard to understand that at some point, no matter how great those hard hats are, somebody's going to get hurt. And so for businesses and employers, when it comes to psychological health and safety or mental health in the workplace, unfortunately, a lot of the practices that we have in, here in Canada and other places are really about providing hard hats and personal protective equipment. And so things like an employee assistance program, things like benefits coverage for mental health. Those are all excellent things to have. And those are really the personal protective equipment of mental health and well-being in the work environment, right? If something happens at work or something happens in your home life, you have this thing that allows you to sort of protect yourself or at least care for yourself and mitigate some of the impact that might have on you. But unfortunately, and this is really the crux of what psychological health and safety is all about, many employers focus a lot on providing better, stronger hard hats, more benefits, a more robust EAP, learning programs or resilience training for their people. But they don't necessarily focus on stopping those bricks from falling. And so the bricks that fall from a psych health and safety perspective are many. And that's where all of those risk factors from our national standard come into play. There was 13 identified in Canada's CSA standard. There's about 20 different ones identified in that global ISO guideline. But it could be things like poor communication, incivility, poor job design, excessive workload, chronic strain. There's many different things that are sort of bricks that can be falling on people's heads in the work environment. And for employers, certainly, again, we'd be negligent not to provide those hard hats or that PPE from a mental health perspective. But the bigger advantage and the thing that's going to pay greater dividends over time for organizations is trying to stop those bricks from falling. And so really a conversation about psychological health and safety becomes a conversation about many core business fundamentals. Becomes a conversation about how we structure our jobs, how we communicate with one another, how we create a respectful and civil work environment. And those are the bricks that we need to start tackling as employers to really make a difference over time and generate some of those positive results, not only for our people, but for our companies as well. So focusing on the bricks and less about building better hard hats. So how do we do that? How do we tackle the bricks? And really, in my view, there's sort of 2 things that we need to think about from a psychological health and safety standpoint. Number 1 is having a structured approach, and number 2 is having responsive controls. Okay, So that's how I divide it up. Part one is a structured approach. So what's the structure that you need to create that management system, that safety management system? And then what are the controls that you can use or the controls that you can put in place to help mitigate some of those risks? So from the perspective of a structured approach, we need a structured approach to do a few things. We need to listen to our employees, understand different risks in the work environment, and of course, iteratively address health and safety or psychological health and safety needs. So there's a few key components. Number one is leadership commitment and accountability. Number two is continuous improvement. And so when I talk about psychological health and safety, the most common way I'll describe it is that we're simply taking a continuous improvement approach to mental health in your work environment, okay? So that first component, which is around leadership, commitment, and accountability, what are the core things that you need? Well, depending on the size of your organization and what it looks like, really, first and foremost, no matter what, you need some form of leadership commitment to this, right? If this isn't a topic that sits at your executive table or at your board table, it's very difficult to continue moving the needle forward. And I've seen this time and time again, where a health and safety champion or one or two senior leaders are really committed to this and try to move the needle forward in a work environment. And unfortunately, if they leave or if they don't get the kind of approval or budget that they need to make significant change, it doesn't go anywhere. I've seen it fall flat time and time again. And so ultimately, this is a topic that does need to sit at the highest level within your organization or business. If you're a small business, it means that as a business owner, this is something that you need to own. If you're a larger organization, it could be at the executive table or at the board level, which is where that commitment to creating the system needs to happen. Typically, we see champions or sponsors as a crucial part of this. Just like building any sort of safety culture, you need safety champions, right? And the same goes for psychological health and safety. So you need people in your work environment that are educated about this topic, that have come to webinars like this, that can champion change within your work environment and champion different initiatives within your work environment. Typically, and this comes from our national standard, some form of a committee or a working group is required. This is similar to a health and safety committee in that you want something that's representative of different workers in different places across your organization. And then finally, some form of communication plan, which is to say, how are our employees going to understand our commitment? How are we going to communicate our commitment to them? And how are we going to keep in touch with them about the changes that we're making in our work environment that supports psychological health and safety? And that could be really complicated if you're a large organization. It could be just very simple. We're going to put it on every staff meeting or every safety meeting. We're going to talk about psychological health and safety as well as we start to make changes and implement changes in our work environment to make a positive difference. So that's the first component, which is commitment and accountability. The second component of that structured approach is continuous improvement, so a continuous improvement process. And for those of you that are from the safety world, you've likely seen something similar to this, right? Plan, do, check, act is how we implement safe work. And the same really goes for psychologically healthy and safe work. It's a continuous improvement process of plan, do, check, act. In this case, we talk about it in a little bit of a different way, but the principles are still the same. First and foremost, every organization needs to assess the kinds of risks that exist within their company, and this is different in different jobs. This is different in different locations. If you have a company that works in multiple locations, and excuse me, and really there's many ways to do it. When you hear risk assessment, I mean, people automatically jump to a survey of some kind. In Canada, Guarding Minds at Work is an example of a psychosocial risk assessment. But risk assessment can happen in many other ways as well. It could certainly be surveys, and that can be a useful tool to identify where risks are present. It can also happen quite simply through conversations. Could be conversations with groups of employees, could be conversations at the team level. Helping people understand, or at least helping leaders understand, the kinds of risks that are present within a work environment. And then it's the same type of calculation that you would use from a physical health perspective to determine what action is needed, right? It's the duration, the frequency, and the severity of the risk that we're exposed to. So, for example, I'd like to think about, say, interaction with customers, right? and perhaps customers are often angry. Say we're working at a call center, and the only, or even on a complaints line, for example, right? So we would say that interaction with distressed callers is something that happens quite frequently. It may happen for a prolonged period of time. And then that severity kind of depends on how employees are perceiving their interactions, whether they're being yelled at or screamed at, or maybe they're simply annoyed or peeved. There's a bit of a latitude in understanding how severe is this particular hazard, and that's usually done in collaboration with employees. So it's not up to an employer necessarily to determine the severity. A lot of it has to be done in collaboration with the people that are exposed to risk, because psychosocial risks in many ways are interpreted subjectively. And so I like to say that when it comes to assessing risks in your workplace, perception is in fact reality. If workers perceive something to be severely risky to them, they will experience it as severely risky. And so valuing the voice of your employees here is really important in creating that overall risk profile for your company. From there, it's the steps you would expect: action planning, actually taking the action, and then evaluating what impact it had. And we'll give my slides a second to catch up here, okay? So in terms of action planning, that also needs to be done with employees. Notice we have the word engage at the center of this process, meaning that in every step of this continuous improvement process, you need to be engaging with your employees, helping them make meaning of whatever data you collect. Say if you do a survey like Guarding Minds at Work as an example, it'll give you great numbers. But when it comes to actually identifying what can be done to shift those numbers, that's where you need to have the voice of employees at the table, because they're the ones that are going to come up with the solutions, because they know their work really well. From there, actually doing the things that you've agreed on, and everyone will have a role in that. It's not just senior leaders. It's certainly senior leaders. It's certainly frontline managers or supervisors, as well as every employee in the work environment. We all have a role in creating that healthy and safe work environment. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But actually doing it and doing it together, and approaching it with, whenever possible, the lens of experimentation. Let's try something. Let's see if it makes a positive difference. As long as we're sure it's not going to harm people, let's give it a shot. And then evaluating. And so evaluating whether it made a difference, going back to that risk assessment and understanding from your people, have we effectively mitigated this risk? And it could be really simple stuff. It could be, for example, having a message when people call in. If we take that call center example, saying, what has become fairly standard now, which is to say that, disrespect or incivility or harassment is things that won't be tolerated, and making that clear to customers, for example, and even terminating the call if that happens. And so evaluating whether that's actually made a difference. Do your employees feel safer? Do they feel that they have less exposure to that risk, or it's become less severe as a result? And from there, continuing that process. And the reason we call it a continuous improvement process is really because you're never going to mitigate every single risk in your work environment. You're going to tackle one, and then as work changes, you're going to uncover more, and you're going to uncover new ones, because our work is always changing. The things we do and now compared to 5 or 10 years ago are vastly different. Think about even the software that you're using, and now it's all integrated with AI. The work is constantly changing, and people are constantly changing, which means that the risks in your workplace are also going to constantly, continuously change. So you're never done. You're always improving. You're always in that cycle of identifying risk and responding to it. And so what I say for organizations is the goal is really to build a muscle. And this continuous improvement process is in fact a muscle. And the first couple times you go through a cycle like this, it's going to feel awkward. It's going to hurt. But the more you go through it, the more reps you do, the easier it's going to become, the more natural it will feel, and the more responsive your organization can be. And that's really the goal, is not to mitigate and reduce or eliminate all risk. Certainly that would be great, very unlikely. But the goal is to decrease the time between identifying a risk and responding to it appropriately. That's the goal at the end of the day, is how can we get better at quickly finding the things that might harm our people and doing something about it with them. And the quicker you do that, the better results you're going to have over time. And so this is the first piece of it, that structured approach. So you need some commitment and accountability within your organization, ideally at the leadership table. You're probably going to need a few people that know more about this topic than others. You're likely going to need some form of group, a representative group of workers, and that could be a group that already exists, that's fine. And you're going to need to think about some way to talk about this to your people. And that could be very formal or very informal, depending on the size of your organization, okay? And then from there, your continuous improvement process. And this is particularly related to risks, finding the risks, taking action to address them, and evaluating whether that had an impact and getting better at doing that in a more reactive way over time. And so the second key piece here, so the first piece is that structured approach. The second key piece is responsive actions. And so this is sort of the fun stuff. So I talked about in that continuous improvement process, how do you find risks, identify them, and address them, right? And so you need to be doing that continuously. But how in the world do you do that, right? We all know about things like, for instance, machine guards. If you work in physical safety, that's very obvious, right? We reduce the risk of you cutting yourself on a saw by putting a physical barrier protection in place. But what are some other ways that we can reduce risks in our work environment related to psychosocial hazards? It gets a little bit more difficult to wrap our head around. The principles are the same, but the actions look a lot different. And so when I talk about how to do this with organizations, I really talk about two specific areas, or two types of actions that we need to focus on. Number one is organizational controls. So what are the things that we can change at a company or at an organizational level? And the second, and this is, I think, the really interesting and important one, is leadership behaviors. And so we actually talk about leadership behaviors as a key control or a key responsive action within workplaces. And the reason we say this is that whether we like it or not, if you happen to be a leader or a manager in a work environment, you have as much influence on someone's mental health as their most significant relationship outside of work. And intuitively, we can understand why that makes sense. This comes out of a brief study that was done in 2023 by a benefits firm called UKG. They surveyed 5,000 people globally and literally asked them, they gave them about 10 different options, including supervisor, manager, spouse, partner, significant other, psychologist, doctor, therapist, you name it, who has the biggest impact on your mental health. And manager, as well as spouse, partner, significant other, were tied. So again, if you're a manager of people and you happen to have a spouse, partner, significant other in your life, you understand the impact that that person can have on your mental health. You have that same impact on the mental health and well-being of your people, the people that report to you in the work environment, which is a little bit scary and perhaps a little bit overwhelming. But we'll talk about what you can be doing as a leader that's actually really good and can help you have a positive impact versus a negative impact. So responsive actions, two types, organizational controls and then leadership behaviors. Okay, so from an organizational controls perspective, this is where we get into a lot of what you might commonly think of from a policy and process perspective. So organizational controls would be like, for instance, having a standard approach to how we manage big change in our organization. It could be other things like flexibility, hybrid work or work from home. Sometimes we know that the ability to have flexibility in where and when and how we work can actually have a positive impact on our mental health. We also know that there are downsides, and I think it's important to acknowledge those, right? This idea of working remotely or hybrid work from home is helpful. Unfortunately, there are risks associated with loneliness that can come into play too. And so other policies and processes that often function as controls for some risk would be things like vacation, time away from work, return to work programs and how they're structured, accommodation, and whether the process for accommodation is made known to employees, whether it also considers how to accommodate employees with mental health conditions. We also know that for many workers, especially young workers. We're seeing a higher incidence of mental health conditions. Think about in particular youth in Canada, Gen Z, or our youngest generation of current workers. We do see higher incidence of mental health issues, and so employers that have appropriate policies and processes to accommodate those health conditions end up mitigating a lot of risk, because some of the riskiest things that can happen in a work environment happen when someone discloses a mental health issue and it isn't accommodated, or it isn't supported, or it isn't acknowledged or cared for in the work environment. So there's many other ones here, and I'm not going to go into any great detail, but at a high level, the policies and processes you create within your organization are one type of control, right? Another type of control is training. Uh, in the same way that your organization may have people that have to do WMIS training, training can also be helpful and appropriate control to mitigate some risk. Now, in particular, mental health training for managers is a specific best practice. And I'm going to talk about that in just a few minutes. But training could also look like sufficient onboarding, making sure that people understand the job and have the right skills to do it as they're hired. Could also be skill development. We know that one of the risks that may be present in a work environment is a lack of opportunity for growth and development. And so providing skill development opportunities for your people is also a way to control some of that risk. And then finally, supports, right? And so these are your hard hats, right? So employee assistance programs or benefits. And what you see here, and for those of you that are, again, familiar with the health and safety world, what you'll see here is we've actually kind of created a hierarchy of controls for psychological health and safety. And so at the highest level are your policies and your processes within your organization, right? Ideally, you have a policy, a process, and a system to manage incivility so that it never pops up in your work environment. And if it does, you've got immediate recourse to be able to correct it. If we think about stepping down, if for some reason you're not able to completely eliminate it through a policy, then what you need is training. You need training and education for all your employees about why a respectful workplace is important and matters, and what their role is in creating a respectful work environment. And then finally, if we move even a step lower, if your policy hasn't completely eliminated it, and training hasn't fully helped resolve incivility or disrespect in the work environment, and people experience bullying or harassment, then they need support. And so they might need an employee assistance program, they might need supportive counseling, they might need some hard hats, so to speak, to mitigate the damage that that behavior has had on their mental health. And so this gives you an idea of what that hierarchy could look like. And if we use respect and civility, that's simply one example of how you can have control at all different levels. But as I mentioned, what's also really important in all of this is leadership behaviors. And you probably started catching a notion of that when it comes to training. But in particular, there's lots of different leadership behaviors that can be prioritized or focused on that help reduce risk in the work environment, in particular within teams. And so for leaders, again, this is a bit of a laundry list, and I won't talk about all of these in detail, but one of the most beneficial ones is creating leaders that can provide supportive management when employees are struggling, when something has impacted their mental health, whether it's at work or outside of work, being able to recognize when a team member might be struggling and respond in a supportive way, and in particular, start to have a conversation about solutions is a really important skill that all leaders certainly should have. There's other leadership behaviors that, of course, support well-being around recognition, and even how leaders communicate in terms of setting priorities and direction. The other important piece that I often talk about with leaders at all levels is role modeling behaviors to look after your mental health. As a very small example, I work with a leader quite regularly who makes no bones about ensuring that every workout, every family social event, every lunch with a colleague is in fact in their calendar, not because they need to be sure that people know where they are at all times, but because they want people to see it. They want their team to be able to see that Jordan's taking off early to go catch a soccer game, or that Jordan is getting a workout in or doing something good for his physical health, either during or outside of those work hours. So they want to make it visible to their employees. And that's one of my biggest call to actions for leaders, is that if you're doing things to look after your mental health, talk about them, show your team what you're doing. Because as much as we maybe tell employees to do those things that are good for their health and well-being, if they don't see us doing them, they're a lot less likely to do them as well. And so leadership behaviors serve as an important control for workplaces as well. And again, this is a laundry list. There's lots of great things that leaders can do that support well-being. The biggest piece in terms of finding out for you as a leader what you could do differently is simply ask your people. And that's a difficult thing for leaders to do in many settings. But having a candid conversation with your team about what you're doing well as a leader and what you could be doing differently that would help them feel supported, included, engaged, or recognized in the work environment is a great starting point to figure out what you could be doing more of or differently as a leader that would actually support their well-being. And so here's what it looks like at the end. Here's sort of Jordan's blueprint for psychological health and safety in the work environment, right? That first piece is a structured approach, right? So we need some form of commitment or accountability and, the infrastructure to make things happen. Like we need leadership, we need champions, we need a group of people that can help inform what exactly we're going to change in our work environment and how we might do it. We need that continuous improvement process. We'll talk a little bit more about it in a second, but we need a willingness to assess risk or a mechanism to, a willingness and a mechanism to assess risk in our work environment, do something about it, and then understand again if it worked. And again, the goal here is not to eliminate all risk over time, but to simply get better at doing this, to build that muscle so that we're able to respond quicker, recognize risks sooner, and respond quicker. And then on the other side of our placemat here is responsive action. So we need the structure, we need the system to make it work. And then there's a bunch of things that we actually need to do. There's actions that we need to take. Some of them are really complicated, but some of them are really quite easy and simple. So we need organizational controls, right? We talk about that hierarchy from policies and process to training, and then hard hats. Okay? And then we also need effective leadership. And we need leaders that understand that their behavior has a direct impact on the mental health and well-being of their people. And so a few ideas around how to get started, and you'll have a copy of these slides, so I won't go over these in great detail, but easy ways to get started. If you're not sure, first and foremost, educating your leaders on what psychological health and safety is, why in the world does mental health matter at work? And there's lots of reasons why. Lots of information you can find online, lots of free courses. I'm confident Workplace NL likely has some material for you there as well. You could start by creating some form of a working group or a group of champions that are going to steer the development of that first continuous improvement process. Get input from your employees. And again, this could be formal or very informal. Asking your employees what adds or removes stress from work. And this is a conversation that can happen at any level, right? At a very senior level, at a very small team level. But simply starting that conversation and even using stress as a way into it can make it way more accessible for your people. You could start by reviewing your benefits and some of the usage to identify gaps. And again, that's more about hard hats and making sure you've got the right and sufficient hard hats. And then finally, improving mental health literacy and knowledge of psychological health and safety across your workforce. Again, lots of free tools and free resources that can help you do that. So if we go back to this, our structured approach and responsive actions, at the end of the day, I see organizations that have done the left-hand side of this placemat very well. They've developed the right systems, they've got the right committees, they've got working groups, they do a survey, and all's well and good. But unfortunately, that doesn't actually move the needle for them. And what's missing often in that case is taking the right actions quickly enough. And so really that structured approach is going to result in or going to help create a culture of health and safety, right? Where psychological health and safety is something that's known and talked about within your organization. That's great, that's helpful, but it's not sufficient. It's those responsive actions that actually create a culture that is psychologically healthy and safe. So there's a difference here, right? The structured approach is what gives you a culture of psychological health and safety. So we all understand what it is. but it's those responsive actions that actually make your culture psychologically healthy and safe. So you need to have both. And where organizations typically fall flat is they focus on developing all of the structure, the infrastructure, um, but they don't necessarily then prioritize actually making the changes or the actions to address those risks. They're well aware of what they are, but the lag time between understanding it and actually doing something about it is way too long. It doesn't actually result in meaningful change or meaningful improvement for their workers. So you need the structure, but really where you need to lean in is on actually doing something about it, taking action, making change, educating and developing your leaders. That's the stuff that, even if you don't have all the structure in place, you can start doing that right away. And that's the stuff that's going to pay the most dividends, certainly in my view. So then maybe just a few best practices that I'll spotlight, and most of them I've alluded to already. And the first one is training for people managers. Now, I mentioned that in that hierarchy of control. In 2023, the World Health Organization released guidelines for mental health in the workplace. Out of all of the recommendations that they made, training specifically for people managers around how to recognize and respond to mental health issues was the only one that they were able to say, unequivocally had enough evidence to support universal application in every workplace, right? And so I can't maybe emphasize this enough, is that the World Health Organization has said that the number one thing that should be happening in every workplace to support mental health is training your people managers. And so certainly that's advice that we pass along to our clients as well. But this is not about helping them be a mental health professional or a therapist. It's simply about helping them be able to recognize when an employee is struggling or may be struggling with a mental health issue, approach them and have a supportive and caring conversation, and then be able to direct them and signpost them to supports that your workplace is able to offer, and then identify short-term solutions that can help keep them productive and engaged at work. There's lots of great examples of that training program or training programs like that in Canada, from the Mental Health Commission of Canada, for example. And this isn't mental health first aid typically, because that again focuses on a different set of skills. But any training program that does that, how to recognize, how to respond, and how to follow up or be a signpost for support is what you should consider providing for your people managers. The other best practice that I'll just take a minute to spotlight for you is around job crafting. Now, this is an interesting one. And this one actually has gotten a lot of conversation and even research from Australia, from our counterparts in Australia that are maybe a little bit ahead of the curve from where we are in Canada. And job crafting could sound complicated, but really the idea here is that what's good for our psychological health at work is having a degree of autonomy and control over how we do our work. Now, that sounds very simple and very intuitive. And if it does, that's great, because in many cases, it is that simple. But giving employees a degree of latitude and control over what specific tasks they are responsible for at work, wherever you have that flexibility, how they organize their day, what specific tasks that they choose to take on that best fit their skill sets. Giving any degree of control over what we do at work is really helpful. You could also think about how we give people control over who they interact with. Do they get to select their team? Do they get to select the shift that they're working on because they value different relationships in the work environment? So giving people control there. And then even cognitive crafting. So even just helping people understand the way work is perceived. A really common example of this is if your company has a mission, vision, or value statement. Most employees never have an explicit conversation about how their work actually contributes to that mission, vision, or values. And so even at a manager or supervisor level, helping employees connect the dots and having an explicit conversation about how what you're doing today helps us achieve a much larger, bigger goal can radically alter the way people look at or perceive their work. They assign more value to it, it's more meaningful to them, and it's more engaging as a result. And doing meaningful, engaging work is good for our mental health as well. And then the last best practice I'll spotlight just goes back to this idea of that continuous improvement approach and good employee listening. So For many organizations, when we talk about a psychosocial risk assessment, they think about an annual survey or a biannual survey. And that's a great starting point. There's lots of survey tools out there. Guarding Minds at Work is one I've mentioned. Stress Assess is another one developed here in Canada. Both are free tools to use. And there's many others that you can find online, some evidence-based, some less so. But effective employee listening, goes beyond doing that annual or biannual survey. Really, what we're trying to build here is an ongoing conversation between employees and management about what's adding or removing stress from their workday. And so you can do a survey, and you certainly should. You should do that quantitative risk assessment, that objective risk assessment, and certainly that needs to be a part of your continuous improvement process. But at the end of the day, what we're really trying to get at is having more candid conversations with employees at every level around what adds stress, what removes stress, and in particular, empowering leaders to change their own leadership or management behavior to help make that positive impact. And so I firmly believe that a lot of the benefits or a lot of the change that can be made to create that psychologically healthy and safe work environment happens at a leader and team level. And so finding tools or conversation starters to help teams have that conversation is going to make things move a lot faster than if you only ask to hear from employees every year or two. And so increasing the frequency of that input and making it an actual conversation versus sort of a one-sided, give us your voice and we'll tell you our plan in a year. And then beyond that, I'll just say that finally, everyone has a role to play in doing this, okay? So senior leaders certainly have a responsibility to build the system, right? That structured approach, a lot of that comes down to senior leaders owning the need to do it. All people leaders have a responsibility and an opportunity to enact controls and actually change their leadership behaviors to be more supportive of all people, including people with mental health challenges in the workplace. And then really all of us have a job as well. And what that means is that all of us need to show up at work with our hard hats, right? We need to do the things that we can to look after our mental health. Just like every one of us has a responsibility for our physical health, we each have a responsibility for our mental health as well. It would be ridiculous for me to say, for example, that my manager is the sole determinant of my high blood pressure, right? That might be a contributing factor for sure, right? Certain conversations with my manager might cause my blood pressure to spike, but there are other things that are my responsibility in terms of my overall blood pressure. And the same goes for our mental health. There's responsibility for each of us to learn what it means to care for our mental health, do the things that we need to do either at work or outside of work to do that, and put on our hard hats when we walk onto that job site, as well as encourage other people to wear their hard hats as well, right? And that's how we get really a culture of safety. When we talk about, certainly from a physical safety perspective, making sure that everyone has a job when it comes to safety, right? Everyone has a job in terms of making sure people are using the right PPE and they're engaging in safe systems of work. And every one of us has that same responsibility from a psychological health and safety perspective. So you have a job in terms of putting on your hard hat as well. So we got a few minutes left, hopefully for some interesting questions and discussion. There's my contact info here. You'll have it on the slides if you've downloaded a copy of them as well. And I would certainly look forward to continuing the conversation outside of today and even offline. And so with that, Kathy, maybe I'll bring it back to you. Likely got a few questions in the chat. Would love to hear would love to hear what people are curious to learn more about.
We do have some great questions, Jordan. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very insightful and very practical and helpful. Our first question is, what do you consider to be meaningful engagement and consultation with workers in identifying and mitigating psychological hazards? Beyond the survey and asking for feedback in emails and staff meetings, should an employer reach out specifically to workers at risk for one-on-ones?
Great question. I would say the short answer would be yes. I think what we need to do is understand all the risks present within your organization. It's going to look different in different areas, right? The risks that your back office staff might have are going to be different from people that are, say, frontline and dealing with customers. But I think it is important where you find pockets of higher risk to dig in deeper. And I'd say to ask more specific questions. What's causing this risk? And in particular, what would help? What would reduce it? And so meaningful engagement is not just about identifying the risks in collaboration with your people, it's also about identifying the solutions. Uh, because likely they've got ideas and they want to be a part of crafting those solutions as well. So if you know of places where there are higher risks, certainly paying greater attention there, talking one-on-one in smaller groups would certainly be a good strategy. Again, all that depending on, of course, the relationship between management and employees. Harder if you're in a unionized environment to go to that level, but certainly I would say the more on the ground you can be having these conversations, the better.
Great. Question two. In Newfoundland construction, which I'm sure is probably similar to where you are, many
Mm-hmm.
large employers use union trades. Hence, the
Mm-hmm.
workforce is always changing. They're hired, then they're laid off based on the
Yeah.
project needs. How would you involve workers in those types of workplaces?
Oh man. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it you really involving not just workers. You have to be really involving the union, um, and uh, and so I think from that perspective, what you have less opportunity to do is consistent consultation, and that continuous improvement process is harder because your workforce is constantly changing, right? But I think certainly your union is going to have great input, I know many people in the trades, and their unions have a really good understanding of which employers and which job sites have quote unquote good culture or bad culture, or have high turnover where people want to go or people don't want to go, and so your union probably has a lot of great insight into what some of the risks might be. So I'd say making sure they're involved in that conversation is really important. And then I think the only other piece, from that perspective, when you have workers moving in and out, is that construction companies do in fact really need to focus on those higher levels in that hierarchy of control. And so you need to have very clear policies and processes in place. And in particular, you need to make sure that your site supervisors and foremen have the right training and skills to be able to enforce those policies. In particular, I know respect and civility can be challenging in construction sites. And that's part of a culture that's evolved in the trades. But I think giving your managers, supervisors, site foremen the skills to be able to confidently address those issues when they come up is maybe one of the most important things you can do, because the workforce itself will change. You're going to have much more stability in within your own organization around your supervisors and foremen, and so making sure that they're really equipped with the right skills is going to be one of the most effective things you can do.
Great. And that actually leads into really well into our next question, Jordan. It said you spoke about training for people managers, which is
Yeah.
definitely important. What about general employee training so
Mm-hmm.
each member can support each other?
Yeah. Uh, so there's value certainly, from an evidence-based perspective. There's nothing specifically that tells us that it necessarily changes work culture, creates that psychologically healthy and safe work culture. Now, just because there's no evidence doesn't mean that it doesn't help or doesn't work, right? Um, I think even outside of work, much like most of us learn CPR or first aid, having an understanding of how to support someone who's struggling with their mental health is a good thing. I think the only challenge we run into in the work environment is that employees, colleague to colleague, only have so much control or power to change things at work, right? And so, if, for example, work is a contributing factor, that there are some bricks falling, unfortunately, colleagues don't necessarily have the ability to affect change. Managers, supervisors, and leaders have a much better ability to shield people from those bricks. And so that's why the evidence leans towards managers and supervisors. I would always say that there's nothing wrong with teaching people about what mental health is, how to support other people, whether it's your mom or your sister or your colleague. But I think the challenge in a work environment, and why it's not necessarily the place to invest first, is that colleagues don't have the ability to stop those bricks from falling. most often managers and leaders do. And so that's why in particular the WHO emphasizes manager training. They do also suggest broad education around psychological health and safety and mental health at work, but the evidence leans stronger towards training managers and supervisors.
Okay, great. And actually, there has been a couple of questions come in, just if you could repeat what the bricks possibly could be when it comes to psychological health and
Ah,
safety. And then after that, we're just going to take one more question and
yeah, no
we'll
problem. Yep, yep. So the bricks, and actually I've got a slide here that I can bring up. I glossed over it, but here's some examples of bricks. And so we often talk about what helps and what hurts, right? So some examples of bricks could be chronic high workload, could be poor change management, incivility, unclear direction or communication, exclusion from decision making, right? Someone else telling me what my job is and how to do it. Those are examples of bricks, and the bricks from this our national standard are essentially those 13 factors that have gotten a fair bit of airtime over the last number of years. Those are examples of bricks. So often there's interpersonal bricks, and there's also work design bricks, right? How work is created and structured, as well as how we're relating to other people, are sort of the two camps of, or the two kinds of bricks that we can see in the work environment. So there's some here on the screen, but those 13 factors from Canada's national standard, if you Google that, give you some examples of what those bricks could be.
Okay, great. And the last question, and then we'll just have a few closing comments,
Yeah.
is could you expand on the comment that Gen Z workers have higher incidence of psychological
Mm.
health and safety issues?
Okay, and so maybe I'll clarify, not necessarily a higher incidence of psychological health and safety issues, but a higher risk for developing psychological issues or mental health issues. And all of us as workers in Canada now are at a higher risk than we were 5 or 7 years ago. That's a result of the pandemic that we've all lived through. But in particular, there's a fair chunk of research to suggest that that risk is higher for younger workers. There's other factors in their life in terms of how they've grown up, the experiences they've lived through, how they've developed. I mean, there's many of our youngest workers that, when they got their first job, they'd never been to an office before. They did their entire education remotely. So there's lots of different factors in those youngest members of our workforce that do put them at higher risk. And so what that means from a sort of a risk assessment perspective in a workplace is that that severity may be perceived to be higher for different subsets of your workforce, right? So something that may not bother me as a millennial or someone else as a boomer might have a much greater impact on someone who's younger, just because of the different circumstances in which they've grown up and because they're just generally now more predisposed to mental health problems as a result of the world around us. So not that they're necessarily experiencing more psychological health and safety issues or injuries, but they are a group that are at higher risk. And there are other groups that are at higher risk as well. Newcomers to Canada, for example, new parents would be at higher risk. There's many different examples where at different points in your life, your risk for a mental health issue or injury is higher just simply because of the stage of life you're in and the experiences you've had. So hopefully that helps clarify a little bit.
Yeah, I think it does. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you
So
bet.
I just want to thank you, Jordan, for all your insightful information today. It was fantastic, and you were interesting to listen to. So I appreciate that so much. We're going to continue on with our psychological health and safety virtual learning series this week. We have two more sessions, one on Thursday, which is tomorrow, psychosocial hazards and stress, connecting the dots. And then on Friday, we're going to talk about the mindful workplace and how we can work together. So we definitely invite you to register if you have not already for those two sessions. And then we just want to point out, talk about our podcast. We have talked about it already this week, but the Signal is Workplace NL's health and safety podcast. And it is on occupational health and safety practices and philosophy principles to protect workers from injury in the workplace. And we talk about all different topics. And we're very excited to announce that we do have a new episode released today. And Jordan was our guest. Myself and Deanne Feltham Scott got the opportunity to sit with virtually with Jordan last week and record a podcast on psychological health and safety and the evolution. And in that conversation, we do talk about accommodation for mental health injuries or mental health issues in the workplace. So it's about a lot more, but that's something that you may want to be interested in. So you can find the Signal through any of your podcast apps or products that you use, and or on YouTube as well. So just stay in tune with us with our upcoming webinars. Of course, we do weekly webinars about a variety of health and safety topics. You can use this QR code to join into our mailing list, or you can certainly log on to Workplace NL to join in and see what we have upcoming. This year, we will be highlighting, of course, a lot of the changes with the Prime Path 2. So we just want to say thank you so much. We appreciate your involvement, your attendance today, and again, a huge thank you to Jordan Friesen for joining us from Winnipeg this morning. Thank you.